Who's ready for spring?
Yeah.
I love my job. I love working with everybody here to build a humanist community and striving to make the world just a little bit better. But I'll admit that it's a job that carries with it a particular and acute challenge for me. Every time I stand up here and I try to speak about weighty ethical issues from the heart. Because to speak from the heart means being honest with myself, and that's not always easy. I have to admit that I don't always live up to the values that I proclaim as consistently or as deeply as I would like to. I take some consolation from the fact that neither do you. I mean, each of us in our own phase of life regarding certain moral issues may do better at living up to our ideals than others. But overall, very few of us can do that with all of our ideals. If there is anybody here that lives up to their ideals as consistently and fully as they'd like to, please see me afterwards. I want to have lunch with you. Now, if we were to have lunch, would I choose to eat meat after this talk? Probably not. But I do eat meat occasionally. I eat meat once a week. That's what I do now. I manage that. I could do better from my own perspective. Maybe I will. Human beings are works in progress at our best. If we're lucky, we're evolving ethically a little bit day to day as an individuals and as a species, although the jury is out on that. But in honoring Charles Darwin with my talk today, I hope that as morally concerned animals, we do learn to evolve a little bit more. Maybe we can do it better if we do it together. The title for today is Why Animals Matter. And as I talk about this, I am speaking from a very transparent and very glass and fragile house. So I don't mean to throw rocks. I also don't expect that I'll fundamentally affect how any of you relate to animals. I don't necessarily think it's going to stop the use or abuse of animals in ways that contradict our values. Although maybe it'll help us all think a little bit more deeply. I know working on this helped me think more deeply about it. We may not get to the point that Leonardo da Vinci got. I spoke about him here 2 weeks ago. He said, "I have come from an early age, abjured the use of meat, and the time will come when men such as I will look on the murder of animals as they now look upon the murder of men." We'll see. As a humanist, I'm very sensitive to criticisms of humanism that identifies humanists as being speciesists. Those are people who believe that they hold a privileged position over other species in some sort of ethical hierarchy. I've said many times I don't consider myself a speciesist, although my behavior may imply that I am. But I don't think that our genetic coding gives us any privileged position over any other animal. The closest I can get to moral absolutes are joy and suffering. And I think animals experience that. So whether they're experienced by a human animal or another animal, doesn't matter. As a humanist, I don't turn to the Bible to find out why non-human animals matter. I don't believe in a God that created humans in dominion over or stewardship for animals. I don't believe in a God that put animals 2 by 2 on an ark to save them from a flood that he or she caused. So instead, I have to turn to natural science that teaches me, as a humanist and as a human, that I'm part of an incredible human-animal life family. We're part of an incredible evolutionary story. When people talk to me about why humanism not having wonder, I think, just look at the development of life on this planet. It is outstanding. I don't believe that we're created by some higher power with any designated role or superiority regarding other animals. I think it's up to me as a higher primate with a bigger brain than most higher primates to decide how I'm going to treat other animals. So I turn to Charles Darwin's Descent of Man, in which he states clearly that distinguishing humans and other animals is a matter of a degree. It's a matter of degree, not a matter in kind. I accept his claim that, quote, the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, etc., of which man boasts, may be found in an incipient or even in sometimes a well-developed condition in lower animals. I also turn to ethical humanism for advice. Since I consider ethical culture my religion, not something all members of ethical culture need to do, by the way, I find its traditions and inspirational body of writings useful in my quest to try to live a little more ethically. And in examining ethical humanism, I'm acutely interested in how it helps me treat animals, humans, and other types of animals more humanely, so to speak. I like Abraham Lincoln's quote where he said, "I care not for a man's religion whose dog and cat are not the better for it." I had a cat when I was young. I was only about 3 years old when a gray and white tabby kitten wandered in the back door of my parents' home that I quickly nicknamed Goo Goo. I wandered through the house trying to catch it and pick it up. It was meowing and looking for food, and my begging and got my parents to let me keep it. My brother had a dog, so I said, fair's fair, right? Well, my son Justin convinced my wife and I to get him a bird, a cockatiel. It was a second grade writing assignment that did it. He was supposed to write a persuasive letter, and he did a great job. He researched the animal, found out where to buy the cockatiel, how to care for it, and in a crisp 6-sentence letter, he gave evidence for his case, reassured us that he would love and care for it, and so on and so on. So we bought it. And he did take care of it, more or less, with regular parental reminders. Tweety, with bright red spots on its cheeks, lovely yellow color, is now my wife and my own responsibility since he's off at college. They live a long time. But it's also our pleasure because Tweety has become almost a member of the family. He's an amazingly social creature. I didn't have a bird growing up. I didn't know anything about them. But he greets us when we return home from work. He asks for attention when we're in the other room. He'll eat when we eat. He sits on my shoulder as I type out my talks here. And then comes down and pecks the keys because I think they're getting more attention than he is. But as a child, it was Goo Goo that got my attention and turned me into a cat lover. We have a lot of cat lovers at the Ethical Society. I think some of the more extreme are Betsy and Nina and Marta and Kate, just to name a few. And Roland's got one now. I think they're fairly extreme, but not necessarily. Their feline orientation leads me to get emails telling me to go see Henri the Existential Cat online. You can see videos of that. I get gifts from cats. I get emails from cats telling me they have to move their meeting because they're feeling ill or lonely. I get recommendations like one for Why Cats Paint. I haven't read that. I totally get all of that. I don't always get dogs. They're nice, but taking them out on walks at 6 in the morning I can't handle. My mother was a dog person. She was a fan of the underdog, so to speak, because all the dogs she got were misfits of one form or another. They were damaged or not terribly attractive. She got some from shelters, some from pet stores, beagles, very neurotic dogs, basset hounds, one bulldog. They were neurotic, they were poorly behaved, rarely trained. It drove the rest of us crazy, but not so my mother. She saw no flaws in her canine companions. When she would come out in the morning from her bedroom, if there was a quote-unquote present left for her in front of her door, she wouldn't bat an eye. She'd bend down, pick it up, and say, "Oh, did you miss Mumsy?" You had to really care for my mother to visit her in her home, let me tell you. One reason why she loved dogs so much was that, in her mind, they agreed with her with everything. They certainly didn't judge her. They loved her no matter what. She would agree with George Eliot, the novelist, who said, "Animals are such agreeable friends, they ask no questions, they pass no criticism." So, I wanted to start today talking about the use and abuse of animals with pets for a couple of reasons, but for one reason, it's more accessible and gets people listening a little bit more. Some people may think that pet owning is just one more example of human arrogance and hubris, and that it's basically slavery. And I'll listen to those arguments. I'm interested in them. Most of you may not have the patience to that. For most of us, I think pets are generally not a morally condemnable hobby, particularly if we understand their needs and treat them kindly. I think that's the most important line. Many pets may help us, in fact, develop more animal-friendly habits in the rest of our lives. George Bernard Shaw said, "Animals are my friends, and I don't eat my friends." Secondly, regarding pets, in trying to figure out why animals matter, it's easy to say that they matter because they serve our needs. Pets are fun to have around, certainly. They're used in therapeutic situations, in hospitals and nursing homes, for mental patients. They bring smiles to sometimes people who can't be reached otherwise, some severely affected people. There's papers written on how pets are used to help those with suffering from post-traumatic stress disorders, autism patients as well. I don't think there's scientific consensus about this, but some claim that the interaction with animals actually increases natural levels of oxytocin in the blood and other tension-easing chemicals. More research is needed to validate these claims, but we do know that we develop very strong emotional bonds with pets that can be meaningful and positive and long-lasting. I think that the ethical status of pet owning would be increased by the mutuality of the relationship. Is it a stretch to claim that the relationship between pets and caretakers might actually bring out the best in each other? Maybe. If a relationship serves the interests of both partners, I do think it's more ethically acceptable. It is bizarre, however, that the human race can treat animals so differently that sometimes animals are part of the family, and other times they're objectified, they're ignored, and they're mistreated. Aaron Williams and Margot DeMello, in their book, Why Animals Matter, The Case for Animal Protection, put it this way, quote, "Our treatment of animals in the modern America is full of contradictions. Pets are a beloved feature of the most American households, many enjoying the most luxurious foods and accessories and reveling in the love and companionship from their human families. At the same time, animals are raised for food or clothing or used for medical experiments or product testing, often live painful, lonely lives in small cages from birth to death. And wild animals suffer in other ways, losing their lives as their habitats disappear, being hunted for trophies, and finding themselves removed from their home for the exotic pet trade," end quote. Now, before I even go on, I want to emphasize how dependent we are on animals. We're never going to not use animals. Sometimes we have no choice over it. For example, everybody in this room would not be alive if it wasn't for the approximately 100 trillion microbes that are crawling around in each and every one of you here. Most of us have this symbiotic relationship, we don't even know it, but they keep the human species alive. And maybe that invisibility makes us ignore them. Before I go into the more abusive cases, I want to touch on some other areas of uses of animals that maybe are in the moral gray area for some people. I mean, I don't think many people would look down on the use of guide dogs for visually impaired people. Most of us see this relationship as loving and acceptable, as they do other uses of animals in therapeutic relationships. The Epilepsy Foundation talks about having seizure dogs, the ones that can detect before a seizure occurs that it may happen, and that alerts people, epileptics themselves, to lie down so they don't hurt themselves, or family members if a child's about to have an attack. And this seems relatively unproblematic given the fact that it saves so many lives. Not so for the issue of horses in New York City. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals recently teamed up with New York Mayor de Blasio to ban horse-drawn carriages from New York City. And that's been a part of that city since 1858. There's a debate going on as to whether those horses were mistreated purposefully or whether it's simply not good to have a horse in a place built for humans, a city. But certainly I enjoy looking at these carriages, kind of romantic view out the windows of the New York Society for Ethical Culture for years. And so there's a part of me that's sad about losing that tradition, but there's also a part of me guilty about having not even been aware that abuse was involved. It never crossed my mind. Now, I suppose that I can be forgiven for that. I certainly can be forgiven, I think, for as a child loving the circus. but I hold that entertainment a little differently now, so I tend to only go to Cirque du Soleil. How many have been to Cirque du Soleil? They employ 2,500 people around the world, but they don't abuse a single animal. So that's a nice alternative in that regard. It's certainly better than most of the marinas in the world that show off seals and dolphins and whales. And killer whales are particularly ill-suited for marina life, as is shown in the film Blackfish. It was on last night, CNN. Did anybody see it last night? It's an incredible film, I urge you. CNN is showing it all the time. It's about an hour and a half long. I watched it 2 weeks ago with my daughter as I began writing this talk. And it's about a killer whale named Tilikum, who was captured from its family at 2 years old and brought to SeaWorld, and has been associated with the deaths of humans in 1991, 1999, and 2010. The documentary, which some people call SeaWorld's worst nightmare, has been shown over and over and over again, and it tells you the story of Tilikum, but also about the story of orca whales in the wild. And they are incredible beasts. These huge creatures live in a family for life. Each family speaks a different language. Some people argue that they don't speak languages, but each one has a different dialect. Each family member does. And they reportedly has never been a case where they have harmed a human being in the wild. Unlike the dozens of other injuries that have occurred for human beings when they are stolen from their families, placed in confined places, and trained to do tricks against their will for food. Now, most of the trainers care deeply about the killer whales, that's clear. They appreciate that the whales are conscious creatures, that they suffer, that they feel joy. One trainer said that when you, quote, look in the eyes of a whale, you know someone's at home. Many of them spoke about their relationships with these animals. All of the trainers in the video have left SeaWorld now, and they all share regrets about not speaking out about what they see now as abuse. They came to understand that the killer whales are not meant for captivity, and that situation is probably why Tilikum had these violent outbursts. The cases involving Tilikum have led to OSHA slapping SeaWorld with a relatively mild fine of $75,000. This is 3 deaths worth. And regulations, but not regulations making the lives of the whales better. Regulations simply separating the whales from the human beings. So now Tilikum lives in an almost solitary confinement situation for almost all of its hours. Watch that video. Now, the Hollywood industry is not free from blame either, despite the claim that, quote, no animals were harmed in the making of their films. The American Humane Association regulates animal actors and has since 1940, when a horse was forced to jump off a 70-foot cliff in a film called Jesse James, starring Henry Fonda and Tyrone Powers. And since then, the AHA has overseen water, food, shelter, and medical attention for animals, but will certify a film with that copyrighted phrase, no animals were harmed, even if animals were harmed or killed. As long as the film industry and that particular production company is following AHA codes, if an animal accidentally dies, it can still use that phrase, no animals were harmed, all is forgiven. Well, more clearly, abuse is seen, I think, in the clothing industry. Certainly leather is problematic. Animal fur has been condemned for decades. Not the mock mink that I gave my wife Maureen years ago. If you see her in it, be assured, no animals were harmed. But even when skin is left on animals, when they're used for clothing, suffering can occur. Recently, PETA got a film of the harvested of Angora. Sorry to tell you this, but the fur is ripped off of the bunnies that really arrive in agony during that time. Even sheep shearing, which I was told as a kid, my parents guaranteed, no, it didn't harm the animal, can be very brutal. Workers are forced to work at breakneck speeds, and as a result, causes a great suffering. PETA says that Their ears are punched, hole punched, tails are chopped off, males are castrated without anesthetics. And now I get to the most contentious of issues, eating animals. Personally, in and of itself, I don't find it too problematic if you eat an animal found killed at the side of the road. Roadkill, if an animal is dead already. Although I might say, how do you minimize those sorts of accidents? But it's hard not to see that the industry itself is very, very cruel. I hate to pop this balloon, but you know the phrase range free, right? You know what your image is and what my image was. It's very misleading. All range free means is that thousands of animals in a stock room are given a small single door that goes out into a tiny enclosure. 90% of all range free animals never see the sky in their entire life. Now, there are ways to minimize suffering. I do think that. I think that you can eat meat in less ethically condemnable ways. But unfortunately, the industry, I venture to say, less than 1% of all meat we eat takes those considerations into concern. Now, obviously, I think that laboratory testing for the benefit of humans can be similar to torture for animals. Technicians wear white lab coats, which sort of give this sanitized scientific sanctity as they strap the animals down and apply various caustic chemicals to their eyes or their skin or their bloodstream that causes immediate and chronic suffering. I remember reading a PETA article in 1985 that I found in my desk saying, do they have rights? And it estimated that back then 150 animals a minute are killed in labs in this country. That's 200,000 a day. That's 70 million a year. And PETA's website today says it's up to 100 million a year. And I know there are benefits that come from that. This is not an easy issue. So I'm not saying this to be polemic. We know human beings can be very crude to animals, but I think very few of us realize how wrapped up it is in our very way of life, in everything we do. Even if you don't eat meat or wear leather, you are being aimed at by marketers looking to get you to eat meat or wear leather. Now, there's a book that I mentioned, Why Animals Matter. Margot D'Amelia is the administrative director, by the way, of the House Rabbit Society, and her book hits very hard. One reviewer says it's hard to read, even if a couple of pages at a time, that they have to put it down. D'Amelia talks about the fact that 22 million mourning doves a year are killed in the United States. I don't even know why. They say that the various salmon stocking is very cruel. It's so crowded, supposedly. Salmons are developing a condition where the skulls break through the skin because of the constant knocking. There's also flailing of alligators alive. People inject steroids and amphetamines into roosters to induce cockfights where they tear each other apart. Now, I know you're like me and you don't want to hear, excuse me, I don't want to hear these things. I want to run away. I want to think that things aren't as bad as they say. So I keep making these little adjustments in my life to try to live a little bit better. And I want to ignore Peter Singer, who is really since 1975 when he wrote Animal Liberation, has been saying over and over and over again that small adjustments aren't enough. In 2004, he wrote an article in Free Inquiry where he actually was taking on humanists. He cited the Council on Secular Humanism's document, Affirmations of Humanism, which says, we want to avoid inflicting needless suffering on other species. Well, who would want to inflict needless suffering? He says, what's needless? Human needs are very expandable. Does it include the 10 billion animals we eat in this country every year? Gandhi said that the moral status of a nation can be judged by, quote, the way its animals are treated. Well, you can be the judge there. Now, I'm going to turn away from the more painful parts of this topic for a moment. But part of me wonders whether the rest of the talk is even necessary. I mean, if you know what's going on, and most of us do know what's going on, either you believe it or you don't, and either you change your behavior or you don't. Same goes with me. I'm in a glass house. D'Amelio and Williams say that it's unnecessary to, quote, engage in complicated philosophical arguments. What we need is a little more willpower, common sense, and common decency. I am a flawed and flailing philosopher. I need more reasons. I need more inspiration to help me change. So I do study animal studies, and the last 20 years have shown research about animal cognition that's really pretty amazing. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni said that perhaps we're on the edge of an era of animal dignity. There are a lot of changes. And dignity is an interesting word because commonly it's used in ethical culture when referring to the inherent worth of human beings. Dignity implies an integrity and a sacredness, if you will, normally reserved only to human beings. Dignity is perhaps what's behind the animal rights movement as it has come today, with legally binding and more morally weighty rights being talked about. Over a decade ago, the City Council of Boulder, Colorado changed the wording in their municipal code speaking about people with pets. They no longer refer to them as owners, they now refer to them as guardians, implying a different moral status other than property. Recently, there have been more efforts to give chimpanzees and higher primates legal rights. More and more people are actually giving legally binding adjustments for their dogs and cats in their wills. So there are changes, and I think the roots of the changes we're seeing now really began in the 1960s in what's called a cognitive revolution in psychology and animal studies, because before that time, some of you know this very well, behaviorism dominated the work of psychologists and naturalists. Inner states of consciousness were ignored in animal studies. Many accepted Descartes' view that animals were mindless machines. That's what he believed, and many Americans, many people in the world believed. E.L. Thorndike had laboratory experiments in which he said that animal behavior was not caused by consciousness, but simple associations. Pavlov, the famous researcher, decided to ignore the possibility of dog consciousness because it was easier for research purposes. And then John Watson and B.F. Skinner basically made this position orthodoxy. Animal consciousness in their world didn't exist. Now, consciousness began to creep back in. I give some credit to Jane Goodall, who I speak with about numerous times. She discovered tool making, as I've shared in the past, amongst the gorillas, and that shocked the scientific world, and her mentor, Louis Leakey, famously said, now we have to redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans. And since then, higher primates have been observed making tools, whether it's for soaking up water, or collecting honey, or sharpening a stick for defense. And recently, a lot of other animals have been added to the tool-making club that we never thought before, including elephants and bears, sea otters. A very famous crow named Betty is documented for having made a wire hook, taken a hook, bent it, and used it to get meat out of a hole. Add to that the study of learned behavior, because before this cognitive revolution, people really thought a lot of complex behaviors, even in bees and ants, were just caused by sort of genetic coding, right? That they were just automatic behavior patterns. But in a really good book called Animal Wise, The Thoughts and Emotions of Our Fellow Creatures that I read last summer, Virginia Morrow, the author, claimed that many creatures, from ants to fish, actually teach each other things that they themselves learned from interaction with the environment. One case called archerfish, that Morrow calls the sharpshooters of the piscine world, learn how to shoot streams of water at various targets by observing other fish. That's what the claim is. In 2011, researchers found an Asian elephant solving problems by using a box to stand on to get to food that was out of reach. And certainly problem solving is helped by communication. And more research is showing that animals communicate in much more frequent and complex ways than we ever thought, both within their own species, but also between human beings and them. Some of you know about Washoe, which is a female chip that died in 2007, that is said to have learned 350 words of American Sign Language. Columbia University's Project NIM ran into controversy when their project was attacked by people, including Noam Chomsky, who I have a lot of respect for. But they argued that no animals can have language. But I think more people are believing that they do. Coco, a gorilla who still lives, supposedly knows 1,000 ASL signs and can understand 2,000 spoken words of English. And today people are arguing that more and more species are using communication. In fact, some people claim that dogs, Morrell talks about this, dogs supposedly have 1,000 word vocabularies, some of the smarter dogs, and even some birds. Now, maybe when Tweety greets me when I come home with a hello, when I come in the door, it's not just stimulus and response. It doesn't feel like it. But what really excites me about more studies are not just the ones about behavior, but the fact that behavior might indicate a consciousness and even a self-consciousness, a self-awareness. In 1970, University of Albany psychologist Gordon Gallup designed a test called the MSR, the Mirror Self-Recognition Test. And what they do is they put a bit of paint on the animal's forehead and then present them with a mirror after having played with a mirror in the past. And supposedly the animals go to remove the paint. It indicates a self-awareness. Okay? Now, such tests have shown positive results not only with some primates, but also with marine animals, and in one case with a magpie and an elephant. And raw self-awareness is amazing enough in animals, but I think it's more amazing when it's wrapped up with emotions, with feelings that I have, like rage or joy or grief or excitement or boredom. And in this area of research, this is the one area that Morrell talks about in Animal Wise the most. She reports on studies that people claim that rats laugh when you tickle their bellies, and that they anticipate play dates with other rats. Another insists that elephants experience a form of post-traumatic stress disorder when their matriarch of the herd dies. There are evidence that elephants will go to the bones of elephants that they knew and mourn over them on a regular basis and not go to the bones right next to them of elephants that they didn't know. Maybe that's where the expression, an animal never forgets, comes from. But memory is important, and more and more it's being understood in animals like our own. Studies indicate that sheep can recognize faces of specific people, that moths can remember things they learned as a caterpillar. Pigeons are said to have very long-term memories, which shouldn't surprise anybody who is a fan of homing pigeons. One relatively famous gray African parrot named Alex is devoted an entire chapter by Morrell. Alex was the name that psychologist Irene Pepperberg chose, and it stands for Avian Language Experiment. 3 decades of study at the University of Phoenix and Arizona and Harvard and Brandeis smashed previous assumptions that a bird's brain was too small to master language or reason. But Alex could identify 50 objects, compare and contrast them conceptually, and understand complex play patterns. And Pepperberg said that Alex was about as intelligent as dolphins, great apes, or a 5-year-old child. Pepperberg also believed that Alex had and could communicate an emotional experience of the equivalent of a 2-year-old. The day before Alex's premature death at 30 years old, the last words were the same that Alex said to Irene when she left the lab every day. "You be good. See you tomorrow. I love you." So when Pepperberg came in the morning that Alex died, she said she really felt like she lost a friend. I felt I did when I was reading the book. And a lot of people are going to want to say, sure, you're just guilty of anthropomorphizing them. You're making them into human beings. But there's more and more scientific evidence that is piling up to support these claims. And given the centuries of assumptions we have about animals, along with the centuries of economic motives to believe those assumptions. Let me repeat that again. Centuries of economic motives to believe those assumptions. No wonder people resist this evidence. I mean, how many times have we seen the differences between human beings used to enforce superiority of one human over another? So it's no wonder that animals are subject to the same sort of treatment. Now in 2012, there was something called the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, and it demonstrated a scientific consensus that animals are conscious and aware in ways very similar to us. The declaration concludes, quote, that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. So, why do animals matter? Well, why do humans matter? I mean, is that a fair parallel? One reviewer of Animal Wise said, it's humbler, wiser, and more instructive to stop looking down on animals from some imaginary evolutionary pinnacle and instead to try to see them as fellow thinking, feeling beings with minds as worthy of understanding as our own. Why do animals matter? Why do we matter? Maybe neither can be fully answered. But to me, answering one is partially answering the other. As we learn more about the wonders and limitations of human beings and the wonder and limitations of animals, I think we no longer have to continue to only focus on what makes us different. We live in a universe where there are no other conscious creatures, perhaps for billions of light years in all directions. We are so close to other animals. We are so close to our animal cousins. One blogger got it right. I'll end with this. She says, speaking about non-human animals, they're intelligent, sentient beings whose cognitive, emotional, and social capacities mirror our own. Those creatures, big and small, that have fed, frightened, entertained, comforted, and awed us are no longer just them. Increasingly, they are us. If we matter, they matter. How it changes each and every one of our lives is up to us. I'm still working at it. I hope you work at it with me. Thank you very much.